Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome back. Video number 2 of Module 2. I believe we're going to have 4 videos in Module 2 now that I'm kind of figuring out how I'm going to cut up my larger lecture. So this will be, I believe, 2 of 4. This one's going to be pretty targeted and probably a little shorter. I really want to focus on this issue of social construction that's brought up in Chapter 1 and kind of, hit that home in a number of ways. So let's jump right into it. Here we are. Module 2B, the role of social construction. Okay. I thought this was a really good way to kind of bring to life, before we really get into the social construction proper, I just wanted to reattach with what we talked about before and the role of the narrator and how important it is. And I thought this was just a very interesting comparison, as we live in a very politically divided world, and nowhere more so than in America, where they're very politically divided. And sometimes they kind of talk about that in terms of news coverage, and especially these two news outlets, CNN, which is tended to be seen as very sort of, anti-President Trump, and Fox News, which is seen as very pro-President Trump. Now, here's what I want you to think about before we look at this website I'm going to show you. Historians and people who write history textbooks, they're trying to tell you the facts of the past. And I, was letting you know that there's all these biases and distortions that can come into play. Well, in fact, you can see that even with reporting on the facts of the present. And if it's tricky getting stuff right in the present, you can imagine what it's like getting stuff right from the past, right, where it's not right in front of you. So just to make that palpable, I thought I would jump here and see what this worked like, if nothing else. Okay, and so this is a website that you can link right to, and what it's looking at is just the difference. There's a whole bunch of things on this website, and we're not going to go through a lot of it, but just to give you a sense of the different kind of words that people use and how they describe things. So you can go through this in a lot of detail. There's all these cool things to focus on. I'm going to just take a pretty easy one, I think. So if we look at word use over time, Michael Flynn, for example, was somebody who's caused a lot of trouble for President Trump at some point. So he's a character in the Trump saga. Let's talk about. And now we have 3 networks now: Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. I'm not really sure where MSNBC is supposed to lean. Maybe they're even more anti-Trump. I'm not sure. But what you see, when you look at things, is that even at the peak of people talking about this character, Fox wasn't talking about him very much. Because again, this guy's sort of an he causes trouble for Trump. So they don't talk about him very much. CNN talks about him a lot more. MSNBC talks about them a whole lot more. And now you kind of see over the cycle too. So not only did Fox not talk about it much, but they just talked about it when they kind of had to. Whereas some of these other networks were talking about him, before he got actually, you see the spike is when he pled guilty to lying to the FBI. So even before that, some of the other networks were talking about him, but Fox wasn't talking about him at all, right? And they're just choosing what to talk about. And let's look at some other things here. Use of the word Trump over time. I don't know what this really says, other than CNN's talking more about Trump. You can get all sorts of things here. But look now at things like this protest that Colin Kaepernick did. So he was the football player who went down on one knee to protest inequities in terms of policing of African American communities and various other things. And so he thought there were things that needed to be addressed. Again, Trump took him on big time. So you can think of him as a sort of enemy of Trump. And in this case, though, you see Fox talks about him a lot. Because he's an enemy that the Trump people like to have, because he was going down on one knee during the national anthem, and so they saw that as very disrespectful, and they like to hype that up and say you shouldn't listen to this guy. And so you see, they talked about him most at critical times, as you link here, but even going on, they continue talking about him at a much higher rate than CNN. And maybe just do one more because you're getting the sense. Okay. So things like this. So there's a dossier that was the basis of some of the Trump when they were trying to impeach Trump, or when they did impeach Trump. And so what did people think about the dossier, and how did they kind of view it? And you see, when talking about the dossier, you see, for example, Fox often talked about it as being anti-Trump, something that's against Trump. I don't know what possum means and a lot of these other things. Even CNN, by the way, talked about it as being bogus, or often talked about as being bogus. So, you know, it's not like they're being so anti Trump to embrace something like this. But the important point for you to take from here is this is a given event that occurred. And now we have 3 different agencies kind of reacting to that event. And what you see is that they react very differently in terms of how they talk about it and what they highlight. And that's really, I think, the critical point. So Trump himself, for example, you know, you see that Fox talks about Trump a lot. President Trump, and apparently they talk about Resident Trump a lot as well. I don't know why this is a former Trump. CNN's already trying to get him gone. I don't know. But again, you see those sorts of differences in terms of coverage from a national media source. So if they are looking at the present facts so differently, then clearly when we're looking at the past, and sometimes things that happened hundreds of years in the past or more, you know, we have to be careful. So I just thought I'd bring that up again. Okay, so now let's get to social construction proper. And you know, the contrast I want you to keep in mind here is between that sort of Jacob's ladder idea of science as a very objective thing where scientists only care about facts and data, and you know, they're continuing to do things in very objective ways and growing our knowledge and getting us towards the truth, right? That's the sort of old history as it's discussed in the textbook. And to contrast that, what we're going to say here is that, you know what, scientists are human beings too. And human beings are very social. And so it is not an individual scientist in their lab with blinders on, thinking only what they're thinking and creating, you know, truth, so to speak. Scientists work as communities of researchers. And because of that, they're kind of constructing the truth together. Social construction. So let's just go with this definition. First of all, a major focus of social construction is to uncover the ways in which individuals and groups participate in the creation of their perceived social reality. Perceived social reality. This is going to be a very interesting idea when you kind of get to the bottom of it. So the idea here is that a bunch of scientists together are defining what they all come to see as the truth of their social reality, a reality they all buy into, right? And this could be, you know, related to things like paradigms. At given points in time, this community comes together and says, this is the right way to do psychology. And they all believe that. That becomes their reality until maybe a paradigm shift, right? It involves looking at the ways social phenomena are created, institutionalized, and made into tradition by humans. A socially constructed reality is one that is seen as an ongoing dynamic process that is reproduced by people acting on their interpretation and their knowledge of it. Okay, let me unpack that a little bit. Just be very clear in the scientific context. So if we think about the history of science, and if we think of science in general, you know, not just the history, but the present of science, scientists do not work in isolation. In fact, it's almost impossible to get any ideas or data out there published without participating in a social exchange around your data. So, you know, one of the things that's core to science is the peer review of grants. And let me just make sure you understand how that works. It'll be very kind of similar to your peer scholar activity, but when I submit a paper for publication, I submit it to a journal. There's an editor of that journal, and the editor now sends it out to 3 other people who they think are knowledgeable in that research area, 3 other scientists. Those scientists now look at what I said, and they're ultimately going to decide whether they think this work should be published. And they are going to give me recommendations of changes that I'll need to do in their eyes to get it published, if they think it's publishable at all. You know, so the first challenge every scientist has is, wow, this is going to go to 3 experts in the field, and I need them to like what I'm saying. Well, so what do? You know, let's say you're working on a very specific memory phenomenon, and you're pretty sure who at least some of those experts are going to be because you know other people working in that area. And so I know Dr. Frump, I'll just make him up. Dr. Frump is likely to see my work. I want him to like it. Is there anything I could do to make him like it? Well, sure. I can make sure I talk about his work a little bit and how my work connects with his work. And maybe I can even, sort of buy into some of the ways he talks about things or thinks about things. I can sort of share a social reality with him of a sort and say, yeah, much like him, we agree, but we want to take it this way or whatnot. And so, right from the get-go of writing the paper, that the people that read it, you have to connect with their world. You have to, in some way, you can't just say, I'm doing my own thing and I've ignored everybody else. You have to literally connect your research to what others in the community are doing. That's what we do in our introductions quite often, right? And we do the same thing with grants, by the way. People have to ultimately read our grant reviews and say, yeah, you should give this guy money. And once again, how do you get other people to give you money? Well, you connect with their world and their reality. So we all start constructing this reality of our research world, of human memory maybe, and how it works. And when we're all kind of attaching to that same reality, then those other people like what we're saying, right? So the fact of the matter is, what we end up saying about memory as a group is something we've kind of all built together, in part to please one another. That social connection. The same thing happens with invited talks. When you're invited to give a talk somewhere, you're having a social exchange about your data, and you want to present it in ways that'll be palatable to other scientists in the room. And so once again, you're negotiating this social world, ultimately coming up with a reality that might be a little different from what those people believed when they walked into the room, but it better be just a little different. Right? If you're going to try to turn things on its head and talk about things very differently, they're going to be confused, and they're probably not going to like what they hear. And so there's this sort of tightrope walk, right, of bringing in new data and new ideas, but making sure you connect to that pre-existing socially constructed reality around what you're doing. Let me give you a sense of two approaches to this. Not every scientist sort of buys into this, but you do see an interesting dynamic, and I'm going to highlight this dynamic because professors, scientists, researchers could be kind of thought of as falling into two camps in terms of how they react to this social constructed reality. The most common approach, and the one I've kind of been alluding to all along, is the one on the left: build and refine. So your work carries on from the work of the current leaders in the field, somehow takes your cue from those current leaders, takes their ideas and then adds to it. When you're doing this, and then ultimately those leaders read what you're doing, they tend to like that, right? Because you're acknowledging what they did and its relevance, and then you're adding to it. And so that tends to make people very happy, and tends to give you good reviews and good grant applications, etc. And that's why most people follow this path. The other path, which I've got a little picture of a guy in the corner there, that's a guy named Karl Popper. He's a philosopher. And Karl Popper famously pointed out that just showing that something works, and yeah, it still works, and I've changed it a little bit, and it works good in this context too, isn't very exciting. He would say that there may be 10 different theories to explain a given phenomenon, or in fact, thousands of different theories that could explain a phenomenon. And the valuable scientist is the one that shows which theories cannot. He would kind of say it's easy to create a theory, but to disprove a theory is really valuable. You say, nope, not that one. And so you can weed it out. And if all anybody did was create new theories, we would just have a ton of theories of everything. And we wouldn't understand, which one to believe. And so Popper says we need scientists who are saying that theory cannot account for this data. That theory cannot account for this data, to literally be shooting down theories. So I call this search and destroy. Find a theory that seems a little odd to you. Try to come up with some situation where you don't think it'll make the right prediction because it just doesn't seem right. Test that and then show, yep, it does not make the right prediction. That theory is wrong. Okay. There are people, and one of my supervisors, a gentleman named Derek Besner, very much adopted this approach. And so anytime some scientist would put out some new shiny theory and talk really highly about it, he would show something that theory couldn't do. or didn't predict and shoot it down. This did, by the way, get him well known. You know, if you're attacking theories well, people pay attention. And so it did get him well known, but it did not get him well liked. Nobody wanted Derek thinking about you don't want him thinking about your theory, because he'll tell you why it's not right. And he'll show why it's not right. And he'll argue that in conferences that your theory is wrong. And so as a student of his, I inherited a lot of the, when people met me, they're like, oh, you're a Derek student. Exactly. So the point I'm making about this is Derek said, to heck with the socially constructed reality. I don't care about this little group of people and making them happy. I'm going to do what I think is the scientifically rigorous thing to do, and I'm going to weed out all those bad theories. You can do that, and you can succeed. You better do it well, because you're going to succeed despite your community not liking you very much. And so, that's the challenge. And most people do not go that route. Most people do not do the search and destroy route. Rather, they go do the build and refine, which is that socially constructed reality. Okay, so I said this would be short. Is it short? I don't know. But the central critical point I want you to take from this is scientists are human, and they're working as a community, and they build the truth as a community. It's a socially constructed truth. And every now and then the ideas of how to do that change. Those are the paradigm shifts. But to think of scientists as this purely objective people who are not, and have no biases, have no, going into a research project notion of how it will finish, that's just wrong. And so that's the main point I want to make here. Scientists are human. So keep that in mind as we read through. Okay, cool. End of lecture 2.